Hey guys, tonight we begin with someone who started as a poor Corsican nobody and ended up crowning himself emperor, rewriting Europe's borders, and ultimately dying alone on a rock in the middle of the Atlantic. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15th, 1769, on the island of Corsica, a rocky Mediterranean outpost that had been sold to France by Genoa just 1 year earlier. His timing was impeccable in the worst possible way. Had he arrived a few years sooner, he would have been Italian. A few years later, fully French. Instead, he emerged into the world as a citizen of nowhere, belonging to an island that resented its new masters and viewed by France as barely civilized. This liminal identity, neither fully Corsican nor authentically French, would haunt and define him for the rest of his life. The Bonaparte family was minor nobility, which sounds impressive until you realise that Corsican nobility was about as prestigious as being the tallest person in a room of short people. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer with ambitions larger than his wallet. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was stern, practical and perpetually worried about money. She had to be. Carlo spent most of his energy chasing political connections and dying young, leaving Letizia to raise 8 children on an income that could generously be described as inadequate. Napoleon, or Napoleone as he was called then, was the second surviving son. Not the heir, not the baby, just another mouth to feed in a household where food was a calculated resource. He grew up in Ajaccio, a town of narrow streets and salty air, where the Bonaparte family occupied a modest house that pretended to grandeur it couldn't afford. The walls were thick stone, the floors were cold, and young Napoleon shared cramped quarters with siblings who fought, cried, and complained with the enthusiasm of children who had nothing better to do. From the beginning, he was different, not in a charming way, in a deeply unsettling way. While other boys played soldiers with sticks, Napoleon played soldiers with strategy. He wasn't interested in pretending, he was interested in winning. He organised his siblings and neighbourhood children into mock armies, assigned roles, barked orders, and genuinely became upset when his plans failed. Other children thought he was weird. They were correct. His childhood was not happy. Corsica was a hard place, and the Bonapartes were a hard family. Affection was rationed. Discipline was plentiful. Napoleon's father was often absent, chasing favours from French officials. His mother ruled the household with an iron hand and a deep suspicion that her children would amount to nothing unless forced into excellence. She was not warm, she was not encouraging, she was survivalist. And Napoleon absorbed that coldness, that relentless pragmatism, like a sponge soaking up seawater. He was small for his age, thin, sickly at times, with dark eyes that seemed too intense for a child's face. Other boys teased him. He did not cry. He remembered. Even then, Napoleon understood that weakness invited cruelty, and that the only defence was to become so competent, so undeniably capable, that others would have no choice but to respect him, or fear him. He wasn't particularly concerned which. His early education was chaotic. Corsica had few decent schools, and the ones that existed taught in Italian, a language Napoleon spoke but didn't love. French was the language of power now, the language of the occupiers, and Carlo Bonaparte, ever the opportunist, decided his sons needed to learn it. If the family was going to survive under French rule, they would have to become French, or at least pretend convincingly. And so, at the age of 9, Napoleon was sent away. Not to a nearby town, not to a comfortable boarding school. He was shipped off to mainland France to a military academy in Brienne, a cold grey institution in the Champagne region, where the wine was excellent and the education was brutal. For a boy who barely spoke French, who had never left Corsica, who was already small and strange and angry, this was not an adventure. It was exile. The journey itself was miserable. Napoleon travelled by ship, then by carriage, bouncing along rutted roads through a country he did not know and did not love. When he finally arrived at Brienne, he was exhausted, homesick, and utterly alone. The other boys were French. They spoke fluently, dressed well, and came from families with actual money. Napoleon spoke French with a thick Corsican accent. His clothes were plain, his manners were rough, and within days the other students decided he was an acceptable target for their boredom and cruelty. They mocked his accent. They made fun of his name, Napoleon Bonaparte, which sounded absurdly foreign. They called him the Corsican, not as a neutral description, but as an insult. They excluded him from games, whispered jokes he pretended not to hear, and occasionally shoved him in hallways just to watch him stumble. Napoleon did not fight back physically. He was too small. Instead, he fought back with silence, with withdrawal, and with an inner fury that burned so intensely it kept him warm through the freezing winters. He spent his days in classrooms learning mathematics, Latin, history, and military theory. He spent his evenings alone, reading by candlelight, devouring books on ancient generals, Roman campaigns, and the art of war. While other boys played, Napoleon studied. While they laughed, he planned. He had no friends. He wanted none. Friendship, he decided, was a distraction. What mattered was knowledge, discipline, and the cold certainty that one day he would be more important than every boy who had ever laughed at him. The school itself was Spartan. Stone walls, narrow windows, drafty corridors that smelled of damp wool and old bread. The food was terrible, heavy stews and hard bread that sat in your stomach like a punishment. The teachers were stern, distant men who cared more about obedience than understanding. Discipline was enforced with slaps, public humiliation, and the constant threat of expulsion. It was not a place designed to nurture. It was a place designed to break boys and rebuild them into soldiers. Napoleon did not break. If anything, the harshness sharpened him. He thrived on structure, on clear rules and predictable outcomes. Mathematics became his refuge. Numbers did not lie. Equations did not mock. Geometry was elegant, precise, and utterly indifferent to your accent or your poverty. In math, Napoleon found the closest thing he would ever have to peace. But even in his studies, he remained an outsider. The other students excelled in subjects like dancing, etiquette, and horseback riding, the polite skills expected of French officers. Napoleon was clumsy on horseback. He had no interest in dancing. And etiquette, the elaborate social theatre of bowing and small talk, struck him as a waste of time. He did not want to be liked. He wanted to be useful, and useful, he believed, meant being the best strategist, the best tactician, the best problem solver in the room. His teachers noticed, not warmly, but clinically. They wrote in his reports that he was intelligent, hard-working, and utterly lacking in charm. He showed aptitude in mathematics and military theory, but struggled with languages and social integration. One instructor noted that Napoleon was better suited to commanding men than befriending them. It was not a compliment, it was a diagnosis. Years passed slowly at Brienne. Seasons changed. Boys came and went. Napoleon remained, silent, studying, waiting. He wrote letters home to his mother, brief and dutiful, never mentioning loneliness, because admitting weakness felt like surrender. Letizia wrote back rarely, her letters filled with warnings about money and vague encouragements to work hard. His father wrote even less. Carlo was busy dying, slowly from stomach cancer, though no one told Napoleon until it was nearly over. When Carlo Bonaparte finally died in 1785, Napoleon was 15. The news reached him weeks late, delivered in a terse note from his mother. He did not cry. He did not collapse. He folded the letter, placed it in his trunk, and returned to his studies. Grief was a luxury. The family now depended on him and his older brother Joseph to secure positions, income, and survival. Childhood, whatever remained of it, was officially over. By the time Napoleon graduated from Brienne in 1784, he had spent 5 years in near isolation, honing his mind into a weapon. He was still short, still strange, still poor. But he had developed something far more valuable than popularity. He had developed will, cold, relentless, unbreakable will. And when he left Brienne for the elite École Militaire in Paris, he carried with him not dreams of glory, but plans. Detailed, methodical, patient plans. He did not yet know he would become emperor. but somewhere deep in his bones, beneath the anger and the loneliness and the endless studying, Napoleon Bonaparte had already decided that the world owed him something, and he intended to collect. After Brienne, Napoleon was accepted into the École Militaire in Paris, a prestigious institution reserved for the brightest military minds in France. It should have been an honour. For Napoleon, it was simply another battlefield. Except now the stakes were higher and the enemies dressed better. He arrived in Paris in 1784, a 15-year-old boy with a Corsican accent, an ill-fitting uniform, and the social skills of a feral cat. The École Militaire was nothing like Brienne. It was grand, polished, located in the heart of Paris, where wealth and power radiated from every cobblestone. The other students were the sons of nobles, military families, and courtiers who had spent their lives preparing for this moment. They spoke flawless French, wore tailored uniforms, and carried themselves with the easy confidence of boys who had never doubted their place in the world. Napoleon, by contrast, looked like someone who had wandered in by mistake and refused to leave. The instructors were stern but capable, teaching advanced artillery tactics, engineering, and military history. This was where Napoleon finally found his footing. Artillery, the science of cannons, trajectories, and explosive mathematics, fascinated him completely. It was precise, calculable, and devastatingly effective. While other students groaned through lessons on parabolic motion, Napoleon leaned forward, scribbling notes, asking questions and solving problems faster than his instructors expected. But outside the classroom, he remained an outcast. The other students mocked him relentlessly. They imitated his accent. They laughed at his threadbare uniforms. They invited him to social gatherings only to exclude him once he arrived. Napoleon bore it all in stony silence, retreating into books and long walks through Paris, where he could be alone with his thoughts and his growing resentment. Paris itself was overwhelming. It was loud, filthy, and magnificent all at once. The streets churned with beggars, merchants, prostitutes, and philosophers. The air smelled of baking bread, horse manure, and unwashed humanity. Everywhere Napoleon looked, he saw inequality so blatant it bordered on performance. Nobles rode in gilded carriages while children starved in gutters. Women in silk gowns stepped over corpses of beggars who had frozen overnight. The city was a glittering, rotting monument to a system that Napoleon instinctively understood was doomed. He spent his free time reading, devouring works by Rousseau, Voltaire, and Plutarch. He was particularly drawn to stories of great men, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, Hannibal, leaders who had bent history to their will through genius and audacity. Napoleon read these accounts not as history but as instruction manuals. He studied their tactics, their mistakes, their victories, and slowly, quietly, he began to believe that he too could become one of them. His time at the École Militaire was brief. He completed in 1 year what normally took 2, graduating in September 1785 at the age of 16. His final report noted that he was talented in artillery but difficult to manage. He showed little interest in frivolity and even less in making friends. He was, the report concluded, destined for a career of competence but unlikely to inspire loyalty. It was one of history's worst predictions. Upon graduation, Napoleon was commissioned as Bullion, a second lieutenant in the French artillery. He was assigned to a regiment in Valence, a sleepy town in southeastern France where nothing interesting ever happened. For most young officers, this would have been a disappointment. For Napoleon, it was an opportunity. He had time to read, to think, to write. He continued his education privately, studying history, philosophy, and military theory. He wrote essays, drafted political pamphlets, and began developing the ideas that would later define his rule. But Napoleon was still desperately poor. His salary was meagre, barely enough to cover rent and food. He sent what little he could spare back to Corsica, where his mother was struggling to feed the younger children. He wore the same uniform until it frayed. He ate sparingly. He lived in cheap lodgings and avoided social gatherings because they cost money he didn't have. Poverty was not romantic. It was humiliating, and Napoleon never forgot it. During this period, he also wrestled with his identity. He was a French officer, but he did not feel French. He was Corsican, but Corsica had been conquered. He felt like a man without a country, serving an empire he did not love. surrounded by people who did not respect him. This internal conflict gnawed at him constantly. In his writings from this time, he expressed sympathy for Corsican independence, even fantasizing about leading a rebellion. He saw himself as a liberator, a hero who would free his homeland from French oppression. But history had other plans. In 1789, everything changed. The French Revolution erupted, a tidal wave of rage, hope and violence that swept across the country and drowned the old world in blood. The Bastille fell. The king was humiliated, the nobles fled, and suddenly France was a blank canvas waiting for someone bold enough to seize a brush. Napoleon watched it all unfold with a mixture of fascination and calculation. He did not join the revolution out of idealism. He joined because he recognized opportunity. The old system, the one that had kept him poor and mocked and overlooked, was collapsing. A new system was being born. And in that chaos, a man with talent, ambition, and no attachment to the past could rise faster than anyone thought possible. The revolution was violent, chaotic, and completely unpredictable. Mobs stormed palaces, aristocrats were dragged to guillotines, entire institutions dissolved overnight. For most people, it was terrifying. For Napoleon, it was exhilarating. The rules were gone. The hierarchies were shattered. Birth and title no longer mattered. What mattered now was competence, ruthlessness, and the willingness to act while others hesitated. Napoleon returned briefly to Corsica during the early years of the revolution, hoping to play a role in local politics. But Corsican independence movements were messy, fractious, and ultimately hostile to the Bonapartes, who were seen as French collaborators. After several failed attempts to gain influence, Napoleon and his family were forced to flee the island in 1793. They arrived in mainland France as refugees, penniless, homeless, and entirely dependent on Napoleon's salary. It was a humiliating reversal. The family that had once been minor nobility was now reduced to begging for shelter. Napoleon's mother, the indomitable Letizia, held the family together through sheer force of will. But the burden fell heavily on Napoleon's shoulders. He was no longer just responsible for himself. He was responsible for his mother, his siblings, their survival. Failure was not an option. Success was not optional. And so, at the age of 24, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at a crossroads. He was a junior artillery officer with no money, no connections, and no clear future. But he had something far more dangerous. He had hunger, not for food, though he often went without. Hunger for recognition, for power, for the chance to prove that every person who had ever underestimated him had been catastrophically wrong. The revolution had opened a door. Napoleon was about to kick it off its hinges. The year was 1793 and France was tearing itself apart. The revolution, which had begun with lofty promises of liberty and equality, had descended into paranoia and bloodshed. The king had been executed. Foreign armies were invading from every direction, and internally the country was fracturing into warring factions, royalists, moderates, radicals, each convinced that their version of France was the only one worth saving. It was chaos. And chaos, as Napoleon was beginning to understand, was the ideal environment for an ambitious man with no patience for tradition. Napoleon was still a relatively unknown artillery officer, stationed in southern France when opportunity arrived in the form of a crisis. The city of Toulon, a vital Mediterranean port, had been seized by royalist rebels who invited the British Navy to occupy it. For revolutionary France, this was a disaster. Losing. Toulon meant losing control of the southern coast, losing access to vital naval resources, and giving foreign enemies a permanent foothold on French soil. The revolutionary government dispatched an army to retake the city, but the siege dragged on for months with little progress. The commanding officers were incompetent, disorganized, and more interested in political maneuvering than military strategy. Artillery was poorly positioned, attacks were poorly coordinated, morale was collapsing. The whole operation was a slow-motion catastrophe. Into this mess walked Napoleon Bonaparte. He arrived in Toulon not as a commander, but as a replacement officer after the previous artillery commander was wounded. No one knew who he was. No one cared. He was just another junior officer, short, poorly dressed, and apparently insignificant. But within days, Napoleon had assessed the situation, identified the fatal flaws in the siege strategy, and begun implementing his own plan. He did not ask permission. he simply acted. He repositioned the artillery, focusing firepower on a strategic fort that controlled access to the harbour. He worked tirelessly, often sleeping only a few hours a night, personally overseeing the placement of cannons, calculating angles and screaming at soldiers who moved too slowly. His intensity was alarming. His competence was undeniable. When the assault finally came, Napoleon's artillery barrage was devastating. The fort fell. The British fleet, now vulnerable and exposed, evacuated the harbour. Within days, Toulon was back in revolutionary hands. The Royalist rebellion collapsed, and suddenly everyone wanted to know who the young Corsican officer was who had turned the siege around. Napoleon was promoted on the spot to brigadier general. He was 24 years old. Most men his age were still figuring out how to shave properly. Napoleon had just saved a city, humiliated the British, and announced himself to revolutionary France as someone who got results. But success in revolutionary France was a double-edged sword. The political landscape was unstable, vicious, and paranoid. Leaders rose and fell with terrifying speed, often ending their careers at the guillotine. Napoleon had allies, but he also had enemies, men who resented his rapid rise, his arrogance, and his refusal to flatter those in power. He was promoted, yes, but he was also watched. In 1794, the political winds shifted again. Robespierre, the architect of the terror, was overthrown and executed. Many of his allies were arrested. Napoleon, who had been loosely associated with Robespierre's faction, was briefly imprisoned. For 2 weeks he sat in a cell, uncertain whether he would be released or dragged to the guillotine. It was not a pleasant experience. He later described it as the only time in his life when he genuinely feared he might die before accomplishing anything. But luck, timing, and the chaos of revolutionary politics saved him. He was released without charges his arrest deemed a bureaucratic error. He returned to Paris, still a general, still ambitious, but now acutely aware that political survival required more than military brilliance. It required alliances, timing, and an understanding of when to act and when to disappear. For a while, Napoleon disappeared. Not literally, but professionally. He was placed on inactive duty, given vague assignments, and essentially sidelined. He spent months in Paris, bored, restless, and nearly penniless. He lived in cheap lodgings, ate poorly, and wandered the streets, observing the city that had once overwhelmed him. Now he studied it like a chessboard, watching how power moved, who held it, and who was about to lose it. During this time, Napoleon also fell in love, or something resembling love. Her name was Désirée Clary, the daughter of a wealthy merchant family. She was young, pretty, and kind. Napoleon was smitten, or at least interested enough to propose marriage. She accepted. For a brief moment it seemed Napoleon might settle into a conventional life, marry a nice girl, live modestly, and fade into obscurity. That plan lasted approximately 3 weeks. Napoleon broke off the engagement, not because he stopped caring for Désirée, but because he realised marriage to her meant accepting a life he could not tolerate. A quiet life, a safe life, a life of comfortable mediocrity. Napoleon wanted none of that. He wanted everything, and to get everything, he needed to remain unattached, mobile, and ruthlessly focused. Then, in October 1795, Paris erupted again. Royalist forces attempted a coup, planning to march on the National Convention and overthrow the revolutionary government. The government, desperate and outmanned, needed someone to defend the capital. They turned to Napoleon. He was given command of the city's defences with almost no time to prepare. Most commanders would have panicked. Napoleon did not panic. He positioned cannons at key intersections, waited for the royalist forces to advance, and then unleashed what he later called a whiff of grapeshot. The result was instant and brutal. Cannons loaded with grapeshot, essentially bags of metal balls, tore through the advancing crowds. Bodies fell, survivors fled. Within hours, the coup was crushed. Paris was saved, the government was saved, and Napoleon, once again, was the hero. He was promoted to commander of the Army of the Interior, effectively making him one of the most powerful military figures in France. At 26, he was no longer an obscure artillery officer. He was a general whose name was spoken with respect, fear, and a growing sense that this strange Corsican might be more dangerous than anyone realised. But Napoleon understood something his contemporaries did not. Military success was temporary, fame was fleeting. What he needed was something permanent, a base of power that could not be taken away by political whims or bureaucratic jealousy. He needed an army loyal to him personally. He needed victories so overwhelming that the government had no choice but to depend on him. And so, when the opportunity came to command the army of Italy, a ragged, underfed, demoralised force fighting a losing war against Austria, Napoleon accepted immediately. Most generals would have seen it as a poisoned assignment. Napoleon saw it as exactly what he needed. A chance to prove that he was not just competent. He was unstoppable. Before he left for Italy, however, Napoleon did something surprising. He got married. Not to Désirée Clary, the girl he had once proposed to. No, he married someone far more complicated, far more influential, and far more dangerous. Her name was Joséphine de Beauharnais. Joséphine was everything Napoleon was not. She was elegant, charming, well-connected, and had already survived the guillotine once during the Terror. Her first husband, a nobleman, had been executed. She had been imprisoned herself and only narrowly escaped death. When Napoleon met her, she was a widow living in Paris, using her beauty and social connections to survive in a city where survival was never guaranteed. Napoleon fell for her hard, completely, almost embarrassingly hard. He wrote her love letters that would make modern romance novels blush, filled with passionate declarations, desperate longing, and thinly veiled jealousy. Joséphine, for her part, was less enthusiastic. She saw Napoleon as useful, perhaps even charming in an awkward, intense sort of way. But she was not in love. She married him because he was rising fast and because survival in post-revolutionary France required powerful allies. They were married in a brief civil ceremony in March 1796. Napoleon was ecstatic. Joséphine was practical. 2 days later, Napoleon left for Italy, leaving his new bride in Paris. He would spend the next year trying to conquer Europe, while writing increasingly desperate letters to a wife who rarely responded. It was not an auspicious beginning, but personal disappointments were irrelevant now. Napoleon had an army to command, a war to win, and a reputation to build. When he arrived at the Army of Italy's headquarters, he found exactly what he expected: a disaster. The soldiers were hungry, unpaid, and dressed in rags. Their boots were falling apart. Their morale was non-existent. Many were sick. Some were deserting. The officers were bickering among themselves, more interested in assigning blame than solving problems. Napoleon stood before them, a short, thin, 26-year-old general with no aristocratic pedigree and no experience commanding an army. The officers looked at him with barely concealed contempt. They expected speeches, empty promises, the usual nonsense. Napoleon gave them something else. He gave them a plan. He explained, in blunt, precise terms, what they were going to do. They were going to march into northern Italy. They were going to defeat the Austrians. They were going to seize supplies, cities, and glory. And if they followed his orders, he would make them rich. Not metaphorically, literally. Italy was wealthy, and Napoleon intended to take that wealth and distribute it among his soldiers. Loot, plunder, call it what you want, but every man who fought well would be rewarded. The officers stared. The soldiers, those who were close enough to hear, perked up. This was not a typical revolutionary speech about liberty and fraternity. This was a transaction. Fight for me. Win for me. And I will give you everything you've been denied. Napoleon did not wait for applause. He turned and began issuing orders. Move the artillery here, reposition the infantry there, send scouts along this route. He spoke quickly, decisively, with the confidence of a man who had already calculated every possible outcome. Within days the army was moving, not because they loved Napoleon, but because he did not give them time to doubt. The Italian campaign that followed was nothing short of extraordinary. Napoleon moved fast, struck hard, and never gave his enemies time to recover. He won battle after battle, Montenotte, Millesimo, Dego, Mondovi, each victory more decisive than the last. The Austrian forces, larger and better equipped, were consistently outmanoeuvred by an army that should not have been able to win. Napoleon's tactics were unconventional. He ignored traditional military doctrine. which emphasized slow, cautious advances and rigid formations. Instead, he divided his forces, moved them rapidly, and concentrated overwhelming firepower at decisive points. He attacked where the enemy was weakest, retreated when necessary, and never allowed his opponents to dictate the pace of battle. It was warfare as jazz, improvised, unpredictable, brilliant. The soldiers began to worship him, not because he was kind or fatherly, he was neither, but because he won, and winning meant food, money and survival. They nicknamed him the Little Corporal, a term of endearment that acknowledged both his height and his habit of personally inspecting artillery positions like a common soldier. Napoleon did not mind the nickname. He encouraged it. He wanted his soldiers to see him as one of them, only smarter. By the end of 1796, Napoleon had conquered much of northern Italy. Cities fell, treaties were signed, wealth flowed back to France, and more importantly into Napoleon's army. He sent art, gold and treasures to Paris, gifts that made the revolutionary government very happy. He also kept a significant portion for himself and his officers, a detail he did not advertise widely. But the Italian campaign was more than a military success. It was a political statement. Napoleon had done what the government could not. He had funded his own war, paid his own soldiers, and delivered victories that made France look powerful again. The government in Paris needed him, and Napoleon knew it. He was no longer just a general, he was a force, a phenomenon, a problem waiting to become a solution or a catastrophe. And as he stood in northern Italy, reading dispatches and planning his next move, Napoleon Bonaparte understood something profound. He had crossed a threshold. He was no longer fighting for France. France was fighting for him. The question was no longer whether he would succeed. The question was how far he would go. By 1797, Napoleon was a celebrity. Newspapers across Europe carried stories of the young general who had humiliated Austria, conquered Italy, and turned a dying army into a legend. Paris worshipped him. His soldiers would have followed him into hell, and his enemies, both foreign and domestic, were beginning to realise they had severely underestimated the odd little Corsican. But Napoleon was restless. Italy had been too easy. He needed something bigger, something that would cement his reputation as not just a military genius, but a visionary. He proposed an invasion of Egypt. On the surface, the plan seemed insane. Egypt was thousands of miles away, controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and offered no clear strategic advantage to France. But Napoleon saw it differently. He saw Egypt as a backdoor to British India, as a land of ancient glory waiting to be claimed, and most importantly, as a stage grand enough for his ambitions. The French government approved the plan, partly because they believed in it, mostly because they wanted Napoleon out of France. He was becoming too popular, too powerful. Sending him to Egypt was a convenient way to keep him busy, while the politicians in Paris tried to figure out what to do with a general who had started acting like he didn't need their permission anymore. In May 1798, Napoleon set sail from Toulon with an armada of over 300 ships carrying 40,000 soldiers, scientists, engineers and scholars. Yes, scholars. Napoleon didn't just want to conquer Egypt, he wanted to study it. He brought along linguists, archaeologists, botanists and artists, all tasked with documenting and understanding this ancient civilization. It was conquest, but with footnotes. The fleet arrived in Egypt in July, landing near Alexandria. Napoleon's soldiers, most of whom had never left Europe, stumbled onto the beaches and stared in bewilderment at the desert landscape, the blazing sun and the unfamiliar architecture. Many immediately regretted volunteering. Egypt was hot, it was dry, it was hostile, and the locals were not thrilled to see French soldiers arriving uninvited. Napoleon marched his army toward Cairo, moving through the desert with characteristic speed. The journey was brutal, the heat was unbearable, water was scarce. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration and diseases they had no names for. Bedouin raiders harassed the column, striking quickly and vanishing into the sands. Morale plummeted. Men began deserting, not to return to France, but simply to find shade and die more comfortably. But Napoleon pressed on, promising his soldiers that glory awaited them in Cairo. He gave speeches invoking Alexander the Great, reminding them that they were walking in the footsteps of history. Some soldiers were inspired, most were just thirsty. On July 21st, 1798, the French army faced the Mamluk forces near the pyramids in what would become known as the Battle of the Pyramids. The Mamluks, elite cavalry warriors who had ruled Egypt for centuries, charged with breathtaking ferocity. They were skilled, fearless, and utterly unprepared for disciplined European infantry armed with modern artillery. Napoleon arranged his forces into squares, bristling formations of soldiers with bayonets pointed outward and cannons positioned at the corners. The Mamluk cavalry crashed against these squares like waves against a stone wall. French muskets and artillery tore through them with mechanical efficiency. It was not a battle. It was a demonstration. Within hours, the Mamluk forces were shattered. Cairo surrendered. Napoleon had conquered Egypt. He entered Cairo in triumph, setting up headquarters in a palace and declaring himself the liberator of Egypt from Mamluk tyranny. He issued proclamations insisting that he respected Islam, that he came as a friend, and that France had no intention of imposing its culture on Egypt. The proclamations were eloquent. They were also lies. Napoleon did respect Islam in the same way a museum curator respects ancient pottery, but he had no intention of treating Egyptians as equals. Meanwhile, his scholars got to work. The savants, as they were called, fanned out across Egypt, measuring pyramids, sketching temples, collecting artifacts, and documenting everything. They discovered the Rosetta Stone, a slab covered in 3 scripts that would eventually unlock the secrets of hieroglyphics. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign would be a military failure, but an intellectual triumph. The scientific and cultural knowledge brought back to Europe reshaped Western understanding of the ancient world. But while Napoleon was playing archaeologist, disaster struck. The British Navy, commanded by Admiral Horatio Nelson, located the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay and utterly destroyed it in the Battle of the Nile. Every ship was sunk or captured. Napoleon's army was now stranded in Egypt with no way home. The soldiers, already exhausted and disillusioned, realised they were trapped on the wrong continent, with a general who had promised them glory and delivered endless sand. Napoleon kept up appearances, pretending everything was fine. He organised festivals, held banquets, and issued optimistic bulletins. But privately, he knew the campaign was unravelling. The Ottomans were preparing a counter-invasion. Plague was spreading through the ranks, and back in France, political enemies were circling, whispering that Napoleon had led an army to its doom. In 1799, Napoleon made a decision that would define his character forever. He abandoned his army, not officially. He spun it as a strategic return to France to deal with urgent political matters. But the reality was simple. He left 30,000 men stranded in Egypt and sailed home with a small group of trusted officers. It was desertion dressed in patriotic language. His soldiers felt betrayed. History, however, would mostly forgive him. Napoleon arrived back in France in October 1799, slipping past British naval patrols through a combination of luck and audacity. When he landed, he expected to face criticism, maybe even arrest. Instead, he was welcomed as a hero. France was in chaos again. The Directory, the government that had ruled since the Revolution, was collapsing under corruption and incompetence. People were hungry for stability. They wanted a strong man. Napoleon, fresh from Egypt and still wrapped in the mystique of victory, looked like exactly what France needed. Within weeks, Napoleon began plotting a coup. He was not alone. A group of politicians, led by Emmanuel Joseph CAS, had already been scheming to overthrow the Directory. They needed a general with popular support and a willingness to use force. Napoleon needed a government that would let him do whatever he wanted. It was a perfect match. On November 9th, 1799, the coup began. Napoleon and his allies stormed the Legislative Assembly, armed soldiers in tow. The deputies panicked. Some tried to resist. Napoleon's brother Lucien, serving as president of the Assembly, declared that Napoleon was acting to save the Republic from enemies. It was theatre, chaotic and barely convincing, but it worked. By the end of the day, the Directory was dissolved. A new government, the Consulate, was established with 3 consuls at its head. Napoleon was named First Consul. Officially, he shared power. In reality, he had seized it entirely. At 30 years old, Napoleon Bonaparte had gone from junior officer to ruler of France. He did not celebrate with wild parties or drunken speeches. He went to work, immediately. Napoleon understood that power meant nothing if the country collapsed around him. France was bankrupt, war-torn and fractured. He needed to fix it, and he needed to do it fast. He reformed the financial system, stabilizing the currency and establishing the Bank of France. He negotiated peace treaties with Austria and Britain, buying France time to rebuild. He restructured the government, creating efficient bureaucracies and replacing corrupt officials with competent ones. He reformed the legal system, commissioning what would become the Napoleonic Code, a comprehensive set of laws that balanced revolutionary ideals with practical governance. It wasn't perfect, especially for women who lost many rights under the code, but it was clear, consistent, and far better than the legal chaos that had preceded it. Napoleon also made peace with the Catholic Church, signing the Concordat of 1801. This was a masterstroke of political pragmatism. Revolutionary France had been hostile to religion, alienating millions of devout Catholics. Napoleon, who was personally indifferent to religion, recognised that reopening churches and acknowledging the Pope would win him popular support. He didn't restore the Church's political power, but he gave it legitimacy. And in return, priests across France began telling their congregations that Napoleon was chosen by God. All of this happened within 2 years. France, which had been on the brink of collapse, was stable again. People had jobs, bread was available, the wars had paused, Napoleon's approval ratings soared. He was not just a general anymore, he was a statesman, a leader, a man who had taken chaos and forged it into order. But Napoleon was not satisfied with being first consul. He wanted permanence. In 1802 he held a referendum asking French citizens whether he should be made consul for life. The result was overwhelming. Over 99% voted yes. Whether the vote was legitimate or manipulated is debatable. What mattered was that Napoleon now had unchallenged authority. Still, it wasn't enough. Consul for life sounded temporary. It sounded like something that could be revoked. Napoleon wanted a title that conveyed permanence, legitimacy and power. He wanted to be more than a leader. He wanted to be a symbol. And so, in 1804, Napoleon declared himself Emperor of the French, not King. King was too old-fashioned, too tied to the monarchy France had violently overthrown. Emperor was different. It evoked Rome, glory, and the idea that Napoleon had not inherited power but earned it. The coronation ceremony, held at Notre Dame Cathedral in December 1804, was pure Napoleonic theatre. Pope Pius VII was brought to Paris to officiate, lending religious legitimacy to the event. But when the moment came for the Pope to crown Napoleon, Napoleon did something shocking. He took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. Then he crowned Josephine. The message was unmistakable. Napoleon did not receive power from God or any man. He took it. He was emperor because he chose to be. And no one, not the Pope, not the old aristocracy, not the revolutionaries who had once promised equality, could stop him. Watching from the audience were his siblings, now princes and princesses. His mother Letizia sat stony-faced, reportedly muttering that it wouldn't last. Josephine, dressed in ermine and jewels, looked every bit the empress, though privately she was terrified. She knew Napoleon's affection for her was fading. She knew he blamed her for not giving him an heir. She knew that empresses who failed to produce sons did not remain empresses for long, but for now she was safe, and Napoleon was emperor. The boy who had been mocked at Brienne, the officer who had been imprisoned during the Terror, the general who had conquered Egypt and abandoned his army, was now the most powerful man in Europe, and he was just getting started. Napoleon Bonaparte was emperor, but Europe was unconvinced. To the kings and emperors who had ruled by divine right for centuries, Napoleon was a usurper, a Corsican upstart wrapped in stolen legitimacy. They did not recognise his title. They did not respect his authority. And they certainly did not intend to let him reshape the continent unchallenged. Napoleon understood this perfectly. He knew that empires were not built through coronations. They were built through war. Between 1805 and 1807, Napoleon waged a series of campaigns so brilliant, so devastatingly effective, that they are still studied in military academies today. These were not just victories, they were masterclasses in speed, deception, and the ruthless application of force. Napoleon moved armies like chess pieces, anticipating his enemies' strategies before they fully understood them themselves. He didn't just win battles, he annihilated opposing forces so completely that their governments collapsed. The first target was Austria. Again. The Austrians, along with their Russian allies, assembled the Third Coalition, a grand alliance designed to crush France once and for all. Napoleon responded by marching his Grande Armée across Europe at a pace no one thought possible. In October 1805 he encircled an entire Austrian army at Ulm, forcing them to surrender without a major battle. 30,000 Austrian soldiers laid down their weapons. It was humiliation on an industrial scale. But the real triumph came in December at Austerlitz, a battle so perfectly executed that Napoleon would forever call it his greatest victory. The Allied forces, Austrians and Russians combined, outnumbered the French. They held the high ground. They were confident, perhaps too confident. Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank, luring the Allies into attacking what appeared to be a vulnerable position. They took the bait. As the Allied forces charged down from the heights to crush Napoleon's right, he sprung the trap. French forces that had been hidden in the early morning fog surged forward, cutting the Allied army in half. Artillery tore through their ranks. Cavalry swept around their flanks. Within hours, the Allied army was shattered. Thousands were killed. Thousands more were captured. The Russian Tsar fled the battlefield in tears. Austria sued for peace immediately. Austerlitz was not just a military victory, it was a psychological one. Napoleon had proven that he could defeat larger, more established armies through intellect and audacity. He had made war look like art, and across Europe monarchs began to realise they were dealing with something unprecedented. A general who thought faster, moved quicker, and understood warfare at a level they could not match. But Napoleon was not done. Prussia, emboldened by its military reputation and convinced that France could be defeated, declared war in 1806. The Prussians had not fought a major war in decades. Their army was still organised using tactics from the 7 Years' War. They were disciplined, yes, but hopelessly outdated. Napoleon crushed them in twin battles at Jena and Auerstedt, fought on the same day. Within weeks, Prussia, once the pride of German military tradition, was conquered. Napoleon marched into Berlin and occupied the palace of Frederick the Great. It was the ultimate humiliation. The Russians, however, refused to surrender. Napoleon pursued them into Poland, fighting brutal winter campaigns that tested even his soldiers' legendary endurance. The battles were savage. At Eylau, in February 1807, French and Russian forces clashed in a blizzard. The snow turned red. Bodies piled in drifts. It was one of Napoleon's costliest battles, a grim reminder that even genius could not eliminate the horror of war. But in June 1807, Napoleon finally cornered the Russian army at Friedland. This time, there was no blizzard, no confusion, just overwhelming French firepower concentrated on a trapped enemy. The Russian army was destroyed. Tsar Alexander the Ren, recognizing that continued resistance was suicidal, agreed to meet Napoleon for peace talks. The meeting took place on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, a theatrical setting designed to emphasize that neither side was on home territory. Napoleon and Alexander greeted each other warmly, almost like old friends. They spent days negotiating, and by the end, Napoleon had achieved something extraordinary. Russia agreed to become France's ally. Together, they would dominate Europe. The Treaty of Tilsit, signed in July 1807, marked the height of Napoleon's power. He had defeated Austria, Prussia, and Russia. He controlled most of continental Europe, either directly or through puppet states. Kings and princes bowed to him. His brothers ruled as monarchs in Spain, Holland, and Westphalia. His sisters were princesses. The Bonapartes, once a minor Corsican family, were now a dynasty. But Napoleon's empire was not built on loyalty. It was built on fear, coercion, and the constant threat of French military intervention. The conquered nations did not love him. They obeyed him because they had no choice. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Napoleon also faced a problem he could not solve with artillery. Britain. The British refused to negotiate. They controlled the seas, and as long as they did, Napoleon could not invade. He had tried assembling an invasion fleet, but the British Navy, led by Horatio Nelson, destroyed it at Trafalgar in 1805. Nelson died in the battle, but his victory ensured that Britain remained untouchable. Unable to invade, Napoleon tried a different strategy: economic warfare. He declared the Continental System, a blockade designed to strangle British trade by forbidding any European nation from importing British goods. In theory, it was brilliant. Cut off Britain's economy and the nation would collapse without a shot fired. In practice, it was unenforceable. Smuggling was rampant, allies ignored the blockade, and the system hurt Europe as much as it hurt Britain. Still, for a few years it seemed like Napoleon might actually succeed. He was emperor of an empire that stretched from Spain to Poland. He had rewritten the map of Europe. He had humbled kings and made treaties with czars. He seemed unstoppable, but cracks were forming. Conquered nations were restless. Spain erupted into guerrilla warfare that drained French resources. Austria, humiliated but not destroyed, began quietly rebuilding its army. And Russia, though officially an ally, was growing tired of Napoleon's demands. Worst of all, Napoleon was changing. Success had made him arrogant. He stopped listening to advisors. He dismissed warnings. He began to believe his own propaganda, that he was invincible, chosen by destiny, incapable of failure. This was not confidence, it was delusion. And delusion in an emperor is fatal. By 1812, Napoleon stood at the peak of his power. But peaks are dangerous places. One wrong step and the fall is long. Napoleon's empire was vast, but it was not stable. Holding together a continent through military, occupation, and forced alliances required constant vigilance, endless resources, and the implicit threat that disobedience would be met with overwhelming violence. For a while, Napoleon managed it, but by 1812, the system was showing cracks. And the largest crack was Russia. Tsar Alexander III had agreed to the Continental System, Napoleon's trade blockade against Britain. But enforcing it hurt Russia's economy. Russian merchants wanted to trade with Britain. Russian nobles resented French dominance, and Alexander himself, though initially charmed by Napoleon, was growing tired of taking orders. In 1810, Russia quietly resumed trade with Britain. Napoleon considered this a betrayal, and Napoleon did not tolerate betrayal. In June 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 soldiers drawn from France, Italy, Poland, Germany, and every corner of his empire. It was not just an army. It was a demonstration, a message to Russia and the rest of Europe that defying Napoleon was suicidal. He called it the Grande Armée, and he intended to march it all the way to Moscow. The invasion began confidently. Napoleon crossed the Niemen River and advanced into Russian territory, expecting the Russian army to meet him in battle, but the Russians refused to fight. Instead, they retreated, deeper and deeper into their own country, burning villages, destroying supplies, and leaving nothing behind that the French could use. It was a scorched earth strategy designed to stretch Napoleon's supply lines until they snapped. Napoleon pursued them, convinced that once he caught the Russian army, he would crush it as he had crushed every other enemy. But the distances were staggering. The roads were terrible. The heat was unbearable. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. Horses died by the thousands. Supplies ran low, and still the Russians retreated. Finally, in September, the Russian army made a stand at Borodino just outside Moscow. It was one of the bloodiest battles in history. Over 70,000 men were killed or wounded in a single day. The French technically won, pushing the Russians from the field, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. Napoleon's army was battered, exhausted, and still hundreds of miles from home. But Moscow lay ahead, glittering in the distance. Napoleon believed that once he captured the Russian capital, the Tsar would have no choice but to surrender. He marched into Moscow in September 1812, expecting to be greeted by Russian officials ready to negotiate. Instead, he found an empty city. The residents had fled, and within hours of the French arrival, fires broke out across Moscow. Whether they were set deliberately by retreating Russians or accidentally by French soldiers, no one knows for certain. What matters is that Moscow burned. For days, the city was consumed by flames. Napoleon watched from the Kremlin as his prize turned to ash. He waited for Alexander to send peace envoys. None came. He sent letters proposing negotiations. They went unanswered. Napoleon sat in the burned ruins of Moscow for 5 weeks, growing increasingly desperate while his army slowly disintegrated from disease, desertion, and starvation. Finally, in October, Napoleon admitted the unthinkable. He had to retreat. The Grande Armée, once over 600,000 strong, began the long march home, and that's when the real nightmare began. The Russian winter arrived early and hit with merciless force. Temperatures plummeted. Snow fell in blizzards that blinded soldiers and buried entire units. The roads became icy death traps. Men froze to death while marching. Horses collapsed and were butchered for meat. Supply wagons were abandoned. Discipline dissolved. Russian forces, now emboldened, harassed the retreating French constantly. Cossack cavalry struck supply columns, picking off stragglers and disappearing into the snow. Partisan fighters ambushed isolated units. Every day the Grande Armée shrank. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November became a horror show. French engineers frantically built pontoon bridges under fire, while desperate soldiers tried to cross. Thousands drowned or were trampled. Russian artillery pounded the bridges. Bodies piled on the frozen riverbanks. Napoleon himself narrowly escaped. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée staggered back across the Russian border in December, fewer than 100,000 soldiers remained. Over 500,000 men had been lost, dead, captured, missing, or deserted. It was the single greatest military disaster of Napoleon's career, and it shattered the myth of his invincibility. Europe smelled blood. Austria, Prussia, Sweden, and Britain formed the Sixth Coalition and declared war on France. Napoleon rushed back to Paris, raised a new army with astonishing speed, and returned to the battlefield. But this army was not the Grande Armée. These were conscripts, teenagers, old men, anyone who could hold a musket. They were brave, but they were not enough. Napoleon won several battles in 1813, but each victory cost him soldiers he could not replace. At Leipzig, in October, the coalition forces overwhelmed him in what became known as the Battle of Nations. It was the largest battle in European history before World War I. Napoleon was forced to retreat back into France. For the first time in over a decade, France itself was under invasion. Allied armies crossed the Rhine and marched toward Paris. Napoleon fought desperately, winning small battles, but he could not stop the tide. His marshals, exhausted and demoralized, began urging him to negotiate. Napoleon refused. He still believed he could turn the war around, that one more brilliant maneuver would save everything. He was wrong. In March 1814, Allied forces entered Paris. The French Senate, tired of endless war, declared Napoleon deposed. His own marshals confronted him and demanded he abdicate. Napoleon raged, threatened, and pleaded. But ultimately he had no choice. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, signed his abdication. He was exiled to Elba, a tiny island off the coast of Italy. He was allowed to keep the title of emperor, but his empire consisted of a rock 12 miles long. He was given a small allowance, a handful of loyal soldiers, and the knowledge that the world believed he was finished. Napoleon was 44 years old. He had risen from nothing, conquered Europe, and fallen faster than anyone thought possible. Most men would have accepted defeat, lived quietly, and faded into history. But Napoleon was not most men. Elba was not a prison. It was a waiting room. And Napoleon had no intention of waiting long. Napoleon arrived on Elba in May 1814, and for approximately 10 minutes he pretended to be content. He was given a small palace, a symbolic guard, and the title of Emperor of Elba, which was about as meaningful as being crowned king of a parking lot. The island had 12,000 residents, most of whom were fishermen, or farmers who had no idea what to do with the former ruler of Europe now living among them. Napoleon, however, did not sulk. He threw himself into island administration, with the same intensity he had once applied to conquering nations. He improved roads, reformed the tax system, reorganized the iron mines, and even redesigned the local flag. He was bored, desperately, suffocatingly bored, and boredom for Napoleon was intolerable. Meanwhile, in France, the restored Bourbon monarchy was collapsing under its own incompetence. King Louis XIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, had returned from exile with outdated ideas and a court full of aristocrats who had learned nothing from the revolution. They tried to roll back reforms, alienated the military, and generally made everyone nostalgic for Napoleon, which was exactly what Napoleon was counting on. He also learned that the Allies were bickering at the Congress of Vienna, arguing over how to divide Europe. Some diplomats were even discussing moving him to a more remote location, possibly St. Helena, an island in the middle of the Atlantic where escape would be impossible. Napoleon realised his window was closing. If he was going to act, it had to be now. On the night of February 26, 1815, Napoleon and a handful of loyal soldiers boarded a small ship and slipped away from Elba. The guards who were supposed to be watching him either didn't notice or didn't care. Within hours, Napoleon was at sea, sailing toward France. He landed near Cannes on March 1, 1815, with about 1,000 men. It was an absurdly small force to reconquer an empire. But Napoleon was not relying on soldiers. He was relying on charisma, legend, and the fact that the French army still loved him. He began marching north toward Paris. The Bourbon government sent soldiers to arrest him. But when the regiment confronted Napoleon on the road, he walked toward them alone, opened his coat and declared, "If there is any man among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." The soldiers stared. Then they cheered. They threw down their royalist insignia, picked up Napoleon, and carried him on their shoulders. Regiment after regiment defected. Entire divisions abandoned the Bourbons and flocked to Napoleon's banner. By March 20th, just 20 days after landing, Napoleon was back in Paris. King Louis XIV fled in the middle of the night, so hastily that he left half his belongings behind. Napoleon walked into the Tuileries Palace and resumed power as if he had never left. Europe was stunned. The Allies, who had been celebrating their victory at the Congress of Vienna, suddenly realised that the Corsican nightmare had returned. They immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw and mobilised their armies. Britain, Prussia, Austria and Russia agreed that this time there would be no exile, no second chances. Napoleon had to be destroyed. Napoleon knew he had little time. He needed a decisive victory to shatter the coalition before they could fully unite against him. He raised an army quickly, pulling together veterans and volunteers. It was not the Grande Armée, but it was formidable. In June 1815, Napoleon marched into Belgium, hoping to defeat the British and Prussian forces before they could combine. On June 16th, he fought the Prussians at Ligny and won, driving them back. It was a good start. But 2 days later, on June 18th, everything fell apart. The Battle of Waterloo was not Napoleon's finest moment. He was exhausted, possibly ill, and made decisions that would haunt military historians forever. He delayed his attack, giving the Prussians time to regroup. He sent cavalry charges against British infantry squares that held firm. He failed to break the Duke of Wellington's defensive lines, and when the Prussian army arrived in the late afternoon to reinforce the British, the battle turned into a disaster. The French army collapsed. Soldiers fled in panic. Napoleon himself narrowly avoided capture, riding away from the battlefield as his empire dissolved around him. Within days he was back in Paris, defeated, exhausted and out of options. The French government demanded he abdicate again. This time Napoleon did not argue. On June 22, 1815, he signed his second abdication and surrendered to the British, hoping they would grant him asylum in England. They did not. Instead, Napoleon was exiled again. But this time, there would be no Elba. The British were taking no chances. They chose St. Helena, a tiny volcanic island in the South Atlantic, one of the most remote places on Earth. Napoleon would spend the rest of his life there, guarded, isolated and forgotten by the world he had once ruled. Napoleon arrived on St. Helena in October 1815, and the moment he stepped onto the island, he knew this was not exile. It was a tomb. St. Helena was a volcanic rock in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by empty ocean in every direction. The nearest landmass was Africa, over 1,000 miles away. There were no escape routes, no allies, no hope. He was housed at Longwood House, a damp, decaying building that leaked when it rained and baked in the sun when it didn't. The rooms were cramped, the furniture sparse, and the British guards ensured he had no privacy. Every letter he wrote was read, every visitor was monitored, every move he made was recorded. Napoleon, who had once commanded armies and dictated terms to emperors, was now watched like a dangerous animal in a zoo. His household consisted of a few loyal followers who had chosen to accompany him into exile. They included General Bertrand, Count de Montholon, and Emmanuel Las Cases, who recorded Napoleon's reflections and memories. These men were devoted, but even devotion couldn't cure boredom, resentment, or the slow poison of isolation. Napoleon filled his days by dictating his memoirs. He wanted to control his legacy, to shape how history would remember him. He portrayed himself as a champion of liberty, a victim of British tyranny, a misunderstood genius who had been betrayed by lesser men. Some of it was true, much of it was creative reinterpretation, but it worked. His memoirs, published after his death, would influence how generations viewed him, but the isolation weighed on him. He gardened half-heartedly, he read obsessively, devouring books sent from Europe. He argued with his companions. He quarrelled with the British governor, Hudson Lowe, a petty, paranoid man who treated Napoleon with open contempt. Their relationship was toxic, filled with mutual loathing and pointless bureaucratic battles over trivial matters. Napoleon's health began to deteriorate. He complained of stomach pain, nausea, and fatigue. Some believed he was being poisoned. Others thought it was cancer, the same disease that had killed his father. Modern analysis of his hair suggests arsenic exposure, though whether it was deliberate or environmental remains debated. Whatever the cause, Napoleon was dying. By 1821, he could barely leave his bed. His body, once so energetic and relentless, was shutting down. On May 5th, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died at the age of 51, surrounded by a handful of companions in a damp room on a forgotten island. His last words were disputed. Some claimed he said, "France, Army, Head of the Army, Josephine." Others reported different final utterances. What's certain is that he died far from the empire he had built, far from the battlefields where he had made history, far from everything that had once defined him. The British buried him on St. Helena, in a simple grave near a spring he had liked. They refused to inscribe his tombstone with his name, Emperor Napoleon, fearing it would legitimise his rule. For nearly 2 decades he lay there, unmarked and uncelebrated. But in 1840 the French government negotiated to bring his body home. Napoleon's remains were exhumed, placed in a grand coffin, and transported back to France in a state funeral that drew enormous crowds. He was finally interred in Les Invalides in Paris, beneath a massive dome, in a tomb so grand it bordered on the absurd. Napoleon had wanted to be remembered. He had spent his exile crafting his legend, and history, despite everything, gave him what he wanted. He became a symbol, sometimes of tyranny, sometimes of genius, always of ambition unbound. He had reshaped Europe, redefined warfare, and built an empire that collapsed as quickly as it rose. He had been king, emperor, exile, and prisoner. He had been loved, feared, and ultimately forgotten by the world that moved on without him. Napoleon Bonaparte's life ended on a rock in the Atlantic, but his shadow stretched across centuries, and in that shadow Europe would never be the same.